Afternoon. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Professor Chude, for a very nice introduction. I hope you can all hear me well and yet you can see the screen of the slides. If not, let us know through the chat. If there's a technical issue, just let me know so that I can address it. I'd like to start off with thanking the Nigeria Soil Science Society for inviting me to give this talk on pedometrics and digital soil mapping. I'm very excited that there is an interest in pedometrics from Nigeria, and that I do realize that many of you who wanted to join this lecture may to join, but fortunately afterwards. And I think my final slide today shows my email address. So whenever you want to contact me and have a question about this lecture, just feel free to send an email. So that was like a starting announcement. Of course, I would have preferred to be in Nigeria today to present to you in person, but unfortunately that's not possible, so we'll do it this way. But I remember last week when we did a bit of checking the technicals that Professor Chude and Professor Raji already invited me and also Mary to come to Nigeria. So who knows, maybe in the future we'll be able to join. Okay, can everybody who is not speaking unmute their microphone whenever you haven't, because I hear a bit of noise. So pedometrics and digital soil mapping, I don't know how much you know about that, but what I will assume is that you are like a newcomer. So I will explain the basics, the general idea of what is pedometrics and what is digital soil mapping. The lecture will last about 45 minutes. And then some topics deeper into the subject. We have a flavor, a little bit of general overview, but also going a bit deeper into some of the details. In my preparations, I did check how active are people in Nigeria, soil scientists in pedometrics, and I did actually find quite a few publications in the peer-review international journal of Nigerian soil scientists on the topic of pedometrics. For example, I found this paper by Chukwu and co-authors, and as you can see, the keywords are pedometrics. So this is a pedometrics paper published in the African Journal of Biotechnology. I'm not sure if any of the authors are present here today or will be watching the video afterward. I also found another paper published in Geoderma by authors from Nigeria, Stephen Akpa, and there's also here Inakwu Ode. I'm not sure if you are familiar with him. Unfortunately, regrettably, really sad, Inakwu Ode passed away a few years ago, but he originally was from Nigeria and he worked at the University of Sydney. I guess that up to today, he is the most famous Nigerian pedometrician, but that may change in the future. So this paper is about mapping the total soil organic carbon potential in Nigeria using pedometrics techniques. And then a third paper I'd also like to show you, just that to tell you that there are people, quite a few soil scientists in Nigeria familiar with pedometrics and digital soil mapping. This is a paper on the available water capacity mapping in Nigeria. It was published in a hydrological soil science journal, the Vados Zone, I think it's called, the journal. And this was by Sabastine Ugbaye. He's from Nigeria. He was actually an MSc student of Wageningen University. So I came to know him during that time. And he did his internship with ISRIC. And he worked with my former colleague, Hannes Reuter. So this is actually a good example of a collaboration between Nigerian soil scientists and ISRIC. And well, at the end of the lecture, we'll discuss that maybe a little bit more. Hopefully, we can strengthen that in the future. Okay, I'd like to start also my lecture with a few slides about ISRIC. So maybe not everybody is familiar with ISRIC, so let's have a look at what ISRIC is. ISRIC is a foundation, and it was founded in 1966. So we had our 50th anniversary 4 years ago, upon recommendation of the UNESCO, FAO, and the International Union of Soil Science. It's an independent foundation, but we are based in Wageningen in the Netherlands. And here you see a picture of the Wageningen campus. So we have the university, we have the research institutes, but ISRIC is also based on this campus. I'm not sure how many of you have had the opportunity to visit us in Wageningen. We are accredited as the World Data Center for Soils by the International Council for Science since 1989. And we are also hosting the soil data facility of the Global Soil Partnership in Rome. And we have a strategic cooperation with the Wageningen University and Research, but we are an independent foundation. What the mission of ISRIC? Well, our mission is really to produce and serve soil information and share that with the whole world for free, basically. So we collect, we assemble soil data, we work with these soil data. For example, we make soil maps, usually on a continental or global scale, so also sometimes country scale in collaboration with partners. Could be like, for example, collaboration with Nigeria Soil Society. And so we produce that information, we assess the quality of the information, and then we share it with everybody who is interested. And we also stimulate the use of this information through capacity building programs, awareness raising, and direct cooperation with users and clients. Basically, at ISRIC, we have what we call 4 main work streams. These are the 4 work streams. So let's just briefly have a look at each of them. So we are involved in setting standards and references. As you know, when we measure soil, we can do it in various ways, and it's very important for exchange of information that everybody understands how we deal with soil information, that we use specific standards in measuring. Pay attention to that. It's one of our 4 work streams. Then secondly, we need to serve the soil information, so the soil information provisioning. Also, here we do digital soil mapping activities, so I'll explain that later as well. Then the third very important work stream is capacity building and awareness. And the fourth one is about the use of the soil information. So whether it be in fertilizer recommendation, in erosion control, in carbon storage, in climate mitigation. So these are all kinds of applications of soil information where we also contribute, partner in projects as the soil experts. Here you see a few of the important global issues that we try to contribute to. One important product of ISRIC is the WOSIS World Soil Information Service. So we have a database. Every red dot on this web map of the world is a profile location where soil was measured. And so it's not that ISRIC collected those data, obviously not, but we harvest those data. We work together with partners, they share the data, and then our goal is to harmonize the data, standardize the data, and distribute it to the soil community and anybody who is interested. It's an ongoing process. At the moment, we have over 190,000 soil profiles, but we keep on adding more data. And like I said, it's freely available under a Creative Commons license. And if you just Google WOSIS or visit the ISRIC website, you will be able to access those data. And well, I think Nigeria is somewhere over here. As you see, we also have data shared probably by the Nigeria Soil Science Institute that we could incorporate in WOSIS. We also have another important product of ISRIC is called soil grids, and I'll talk about that quite a bit more in the lecture later. So this is really the result of soil mapping that we do. And here is an example of the soil organic carbon stock in the topsoil, our global map of the carbon stock. And this is the website that you could visit if you are interested in those maps. They are at a 250-meter resolution. We also have the World Soil Museum as part of ISRIC in Wageningen. So we have, I think, over 1,000 soil monoliths, of which about 100 are on display in our museum. Here you can see my colleague Stefan Mantel, explaining what you see in the soil monolith to an excursion, a group of people visiting the university, the World Soil Museum. And then we also have, as part of our capacity building program, an annual spring school. So spring in the Netherlands, that's around May. So usually in May every year, we organize a spring school, also one on a digital soil mapping. So you can actually see here myself in action, presenting to the participants a lecture on geostatistics for soil mapping. I'm not sure if you can read that. So that was a little bit just an introduction about ISRIC. Let's now go to the main topic of the presentation on pedometrics and digital soil mapping. So what is pedometrics? Well, the formal definition of pedometrics is that it is the application of mathematical and statistical methods for the study of the distribution and genesis of soils. So as you can see, there's the mathematics part and the statistics part. There's also a bit of GIS and computation. So in computer science involved in pedometrics, it is a discipline within soil science, but it makes a lot of use of mathematical and statistical methods. So for example, in the international pedometrics is also a commission of that union, as there are so many other commissions. So it's like, you have soil physics, soil biology, soil chemistry. So pedometrics is also one of the subdisciplines of soil science. The Pedometrics Commission existed in 2017, 25 years. So in 2017, we had a conference because the pedometrics community, they meet about every 2 years. So every 2 years, conference. And to celebrate the 25th year's existence, we had a conference in Wageningen. As you can see here, we had a big cake. So this is really a cake that was shared with all the participants of that meeting. So we had over 300 participants celebrating 25 years of pedometrics. There's also a website, so you can go to pedometrics.org to get all information. For example, we have a newsletter. It's called the Pedometron, which gives all the latest news about the developments in pedometrics. There's also a book that you could order on pedometrics that was published 1 or 2 years ago. Now, so if you're interested, you can get a hold of a copy of that book, perhaps. But I think I should warn you that the book has over 700 pages, so it's quite a thick book. But it explains everything about pedometrics. Okay, so pedometrics. Well, actually, if you look at it, actually it covers a lot of topics, and I'll just briefly go through those topics one by one. So maybe that really goes back to the roots of pedometrics, the geostatistics. I already mentioned pedometrics is about applying mathematical and statistical methods. So geostatistics is really at the core of pedometrics. And we use geostatistics in pedometrics to quantify, to characterize the soil variation in space and also in space and time. And I'm not sure if you have a background in geostatistics. If you have, I haven't, that it may be difficult to interpret these equations over here. But if you do, then you would recognize that this is what we call a semi-variogram. So the semi-variogram basically explains, models, quantifies the variation of a soil property, can be the clay content, can be organic carbon, can be pH of the soil. That's the Z in this equation at 2 locations, location S plus H. So 2 locations that are separate a distance H, and it looks at the squared difference between those 2 soil measurements. On average, expected value is here. I'm not going into the details here. So basically, the semi-variogram tells you how much is the soil variation as a function of the distance between locations. You can do that in space, but you can also extend it to space and time. So here I have a space-time semi-variogram where h refers to the distance in space and u refers to the distance in time. And then you get graphs like this. So the origin is over here. This is where two locations have 0 distance in space and 0 distance in time. And as we increase the distance in space or increase the distance in time, the semivariance, the degree of spatial variation increases, because this is an increasing function, and here as well. So that is really what geostatistics does, tries to quantify, model the variation of soil properties in space and time. And then it can also use that to make maps. The pictures I show here are just to illustrate that you need, obviously, soil measurements in order to be able to do geostatistics. You need data to estimate those semi-variograms. For example, soil moisture can be measured by taking these rings and maybe put them in, weigh them and do the put them in the oven, dry, and let the water vapor and measure again. Then you get the soil water content. You can also use, like, for example, time domain reflectometry to measure soil moisture in the field. And you can even use remote sensing to measure soil moisture content. And it's good to mention that when you take measurements in these different ways, you also measure at different scales, right? Because remote sensing will measure soil water content at very large areas, maybe 1 by 1 kilometer or maybe 100 by 100 meter. I don't know exactly, depends on the satellite. Whereas with the TDR, you measure it at a very small soil sample. And geostatistics also allows you to address those scale effects. So geostatistical modeling of variation of soil is a very important aspect, component of pedometrics. Another important topic that we cover in pedometrics is dealing with soil spectral observations, so proximal soil sensing. I think that many of you will be quite familiar with. Actually, I think really the core of doing soil spectral analysis is very strong in Africa. We used to be partner in the AFSIS project, and the majority of the observations taken were using proximal soil sensing. So we use some kind of a sensor to measure the soil, and then we sections, we get the spectra, and then we try to predict the soil properties, again, like pH, for example, is here an example, using the signal that we get with our sensor. And we need to somehow calibrate those models. And then we can see how well we did by plotting the predicted pH against the actual, the observed pH. And the better our prediction, the closer the points are to the one-to-one line, right? So this conversion of a spectral signal to the actual soil property, to the wet chemistry soil observation, that is something that we do in pedometrics. Another topic, so we'll just go through a list of topics that pedometrics covers, is dealing with uncertainty propagation. So really pedometrics, because it makes use of statistical methods, a very important aspect of pedometrics is that we always try to quantify the accuracy of our predictions. You might also say the uncertainty that we have about predictions. For example, when we later on in the lecture, I'll show you some maps that we produce using digital soil mapping. So it's very important that we always try to quantify the accuracy of those maps, quantify the uncertainty that goes prediction of the map at any location in our study area. Now, once we have been able to quantify the uncertainty in our soil maps, we can also analyze how the uncertainty propagates through models. So for example, you have a crop yield model, or you have an erosion model, or you have a greenhouse gas emission model, any kind of model that needs soil information as input. Then if that input is uncertain, if the input to a model is uncertain, then the model output, for example, the predicted crop yield, will be uncertain as well. And the idea, the goal of uncertainty propagation is to analyze how large is the uncertainty in the model output given uncertainty in the model input. It's really about uncertainty propagation. And that's something that is part of pedometrics. We try to analyze that. It can get more complicated than I just said, because we not only have uncertainty in our inputs to the model, but we may also have uncertainty in the model parameters, in the model structure, in the mathematical solution methods that we use to solve our model. So the uncertainty in our model output has actually a lot of sources of uncertainty that all contribute to the model output uncertainty. It's important to quantify how accurate are our model outputs. And it's also very useful if you're able to say, okay, so which were the main sources of uncertainty? That's also part of uncertainty propagation. I have an example of that. So let's have a look at that simple example about liming land. I will be addressing a field in the Netherlands, but of course the example could easily also be extrapolated to Africa, to Nigeria, and instead of liming, we could also, for example, address fertilizer. Should we fertilize the land, yes or not, and how much should we fertilize? So, and I'm going to give you a simple example of how uncertainty propagation can be applied to such a case. So a farmer needs to decide, shall I lime my land, yes or no? So the first question that the farmer needs to answer is it actually needed? Is the pH of the soil too low so that liming is required? And will it also work? Will liming lead to an increase of the pH, and through that, of course, to an increase of the yield? And will it also pay off? Because when you lime your land, you need to invest. When you fertilize your land, you need to invest. You need to buy the fertilizer, you need to put it on your land, so there are costs involved. So it will only pay off if the economic return, because of the crop yield, is larger than your investment. So these are the kind of questions that the farmer needs to answer in order to be able to decide whether to lime the land, yes or no. And so basically what the farmer will do, well, he will probably take a soil sample, usually a composite, a bulk sample. So at many locations in the field, take a subsample, merge it all together, and then analyze that sample, in this case, on the pH in the lab, or maybe using proximal soil sensing. That's also possible. And then the question is the pH below the threshold? If it's not, then there's no need to apply lime. If the pH is below the threshold, then yes, the farmer decides to apply lime. So it will be, well, with a tractor or whatever, it will be applied. There will be a response of the soil, and then the crop will also respond to the new pH status of the soil. Basically, that's what happens. That's the flow chart. Now, there are lots of uncertainties when you go and look at this flow chart in detail. For example, when we take our soil sample to the lab, well, that soil sample is only a sample from the field. So we have a sampling error, right? It's only a composite sample, and it doesn't reflect, it's not exactly equal to the pH of the soil of the whole field. It's only a sample that you take. And then in the lab, the pre-treatment, the lab analysis may also cause uncertainty. Right? There will be errors made, maybe not large, but there will for sure be, for example, random errors. No instrument is perfect. So that's another source of uncertainty. And then when we decide to apply lime, well, we aim to apply it uniformly across our study area, but in practice, we will not be able to do so. So there will be some uncertainty there as well. And then it's hard to tell how much will actually the pH of the soil increase when we apply lime. And this is probably soil chemistry, quite complicated, not my area of expertise, but for sure it's very difficult to predict. So we have models for that, but those models have uncertainties. And then we also don't know what is the response of the crop to the increase of the pH. That is also uncertain. So as you can see, there's really lots of uncertainties involved. And then finally, for a farmer, also important that in the end, when you have your crop yield, and when suppose you have an increase, then how many dollars, how many euros, I don't know what is the Nigerian currency, will that deliver, right? So you also have your economic uncertainty. So lots of uncertainties involved, and those uncertainties all propagate to the final end result. So how can you analyze uncertainty propagation? Well, one way of doing that is called Monte Carlo uncertainty propagation. And Monte Carlo comes from the city in France, in the south of France, where they have a lot of casinos. So there's a lot of gambling, random number generation, you might say. So the idea is that you represent the uncertainty, for example, about the soil property, about the lime application, about the effect of lime on pH by probability distribution. So maybe like a normal distribution or whatever probability distribution is appropriate. And the goal of an uncertainty propagation is to derive how uncertain is the model, what's the probability distribution of your model output given the uncertainty in your inputs, given the probability distributions of your uncertain inputs. And the Monte Carlo method, basically, it works like this. So we have characterized our uncertain inputs by probability distribution. We use some kind of random number generator to sample a possible reality from that uncertain input. And we run our model using that sampled possible true value. And we store the output. But then we do this again. So we repeat this many times. Here I wrote at least 100 times. Sometimes you need even more. So you repeatedly throw the dice. You repeatedly generate random numbers using the random number generator and sample a possible value from your input, run your model, store the result, and then in the end you get, for example, 100 possible model outputs. Each of them could be the true one, you just don't know which one it is. And then you look at the spread, basically the distribution of your model outputs. If they're all very similar, then you have very little uncertainty. If they are like really wide distribution, highs and lows, then it means basically that you're very uncertain about that model output. So we did that for this simple case of liming a field in the Netherlands for sugar beet production. And as you can see, the yield is here on the x-axis. The probability, the frequency is on the y-axis. So we have a histogram here. So most likely the yield is around 12 ton per hectare, I think it is. But it might be bigger than that, 16, but it might also be lower than it, only 6 or 8 ton. So there's quite some uncertainty. And this is not the yield itself, it's actually the yield gain. So this is about applying lime. How much is the payoff, the extra yield that you gain by applying the lime? So you are certain that you will get an increase in your yield, but you don't know how much it will be. That's the uncertainty that you have. And we also analyzed what are then the main sources of the uncertainty. So this pie chart tells you that the purple color, the crop response to pH, was in our case the major source of uncertainty. But the response of the soil, the pH of the soil to lime application also had a large contribution. The lime application, you remember maybe that it's not possible to put a uniform distribution across the area. It's also a major source of uncertainty. And then there is the lab error, and actually the sampling error in our exercise was quite small contribution. So we had a composite sample of 25 subsamples, and that was enough to get an accurate estimate of the field average pH. So this is just an illustration, right? But in general, it's possible using these uncertainty propagation techniques to analyze how do various sources of uncertainty propagate through a model, for example, here a crop yield model, but could also be an erosion model. And that allows us to quantify how uncertain we are, how accurate is the model output, and also very nice, it can tell you what are the main sources of uncertainty, because this will help you to tell if you want to reduce the uncertainty, then of course you need to focus on the main sources of uncertainty. Okay, that was one of the topics that I paid a little bit more attention to, but we still have to work our way through the list of the various topics that are part of Pedometrics. So I hope you're still okay and that you can follow my presentation. I didn't mention it at the beginning, but if you have questions, please keep them until the end of the lecture, and then we have a session to address questions and remarks. And for those of you watching this video later, I already mentioned you can always send me an email if you'd like to know more or have a question. Okay, another topic within Pedometrics is actually towards mechanistic modeling of soil processes. So soil genesis processes, soil landscape evolution processes. So this is really the deterministic kind of modeling. Of course, we know that soils are not isolated from their environment. They have connections with the vegetation, with water, with topography. And so when we model soil landscape processes, we include all those interactions. We have erosion, we have sedimentation, we have flows, we have the role of water. So a certain group, a working group of the Pedometrics Commission is addressing these kind of issues, try to model in a quantitative way using numerical models the soil landscape evolution processes. We will have, by the way, one of my colleagues of Wageningen University will do his PhD defense 2 days from now on this very topic. Another topic, so I think we have 3 more topics to go, is on sampling designs. Also a very important topic of Pedometrics. So let me just run this once more, and I'll explain this figure that you see here in a minute. So basically, you know, when we sample the soil, we have some important decisions to take. We have to decide what shall we sample, how many soil samples shall we take, and where should those soil samples be, right? So this is all to do with sampling design optimization. And the idea is really you have a goal, you want to reach a certain objective, and that objective is realized, you want to realize that in the cheapest way possible, but you need to reach a certain level of accuracy. So it's very important that you think about where shall I collect my soil samples and how many do I need in total. And we have numerical techniques to decide, given a criterion, what are the optimal locations of those soil samples. And that's what the animation that I showed you, and I'll show it to you in a minute again, is really a very simple illustration explaining, suppose you want to estimate the average over a study area, then this design, where you have like a regular design, like more or less 4 by 4 rows, excuse me, 4 rows by 4 columns, but it's a little bit pushed towards the edges. If you look carefully, that turns out to be more or less the optimal design. But when you have different criteria, you can get very different optimum designs. Very much depends. Maybe, for example, if in this part of your area, the soil variability would be higher than over here, and you know that, you will find that there will be more points allocated to this part of the area than to this part. So we have these kind of numerical, iterative algorithms that from a random starting configuration of points converge to the optimal. So I'll show that just once more again. So you see this, well, it goes very fast, but basically converging to the optimal design. It's not completely there yet, maybe, so we should maybe run a few more iterations to get a stable end solution. Just an illustration that sampling design optimization is an important topic within Pedometrics. Okay, and then, yeah, maybe the last topic that I kept for last is digital soil mapping, and that I will also address in much more detail. So it is actually digital soil mapping is one of the topics covered by Pedometrics. Yeah, it's fair to say that it's the biggest of all. There's a lot of attention for digital soil mapping. So what is then digital soil mapping? Well, this is the definition. You can read it. It's a bit of a long definition, but it's really about, of course, what the goal is to map the soil. But it, unlike conventional soil mapping, it makes use of mathematical and statistical models. And those models establish the relationship between the soil that you want to know, the soil properties, or the soil class can also be, and the explanatory environmental variables. So I mentioned before that soil is not isolated, and you know better than me from the environment. So soil is related to climate, to organisms, to parent material, to topography. And Dokuchaev, maybe the most famous soil scientist on Earth, well, from the 19th century, he developed this model CLORPT. So soil is a function of climate, organisms, relief, parent material, and time. And that's, of course, a basic information known from soil science, and also used in conventional soil mapping. But digital soil mapping also tries to benefit, to exploit that relationship. So we know that soil is related to those environmental variables. And in digital soil mapping, our aim is to come up with those functions F that predict the soil from the environmental explanatory variables. And here's a flow chart how that works. So basically, of course, you need soil data. You cannot do digital soil mapping without soil observations. So you have your soil observations, and maybe you do some kind of sampling design optimization that I mentioned before to decide where to sample, how many soil samples you need. But you also need your environmental variables. So maybe using remote sensing, using digital elevation models, land cover maps, land use maps, vegetation indices, climate maps. So we have all those explanatory environmental variables. We also often call them, I'm not sure if you can read that here, covariates in Pedometrics, in digital soil mapping. So we have lots of maps of explanatory variables. And then in a GIS, in a geographic information system, we do an overlay of these points over all those covariates. And then we get what we call a regression matrix. So a regression matrix basically stores the soil property, Y, and all the explanatory soil environmental variables from those covariates X1, X2, up to XP. So basically every column is either the soil or a covariate. Every row is a location, is a soil sample, a case. So, and that regression matrix allows us to fit a model, a function that relates the explanatory variables to our dependent soil property. So we fit a model, and once we have fit that model, we have quantified this relationship. We can use this function to predict the soil everywhere in our area where we have the covariates. And because they are known everywhere, they're available as maps, we can make our map. Also want to do some kind of a validation or cross-validation to check how accurate is our map. Like I said before, in Pedometrics, very important, we always try to quantify the accuracy, the uncertainty of the products that we produce. Okay. Yeah, okay, let's go back. Digital soil mapping, how long is it around? I don't know, maybe it started 20 years ago, 25 years ago, but actually the term digital soil mapping, which by the way was coined by Alex McBratney from the University of Sydney. So he's probably the most important pedometrician that we have. So he came up with this term, and it has really took off. And we're using it really a lot nowadays. And one of the reasons is you need those covariates, you need those environmental variables, and we have so many of them nowadays. And they also get much and much better, higher resolution. So these are two digital elevation models of the same area, but this one has much more detail, much finer resolution than this one. And you can imagine having this DEM allows you to much better establish the relationship between the soil and terrain than having this DEM. We also have airborne information. So we can measure radioactive elements, potassium, I think this is thorium, uranium in rocks. This gives us information about the parent material, one of the soil forming factors. We can also use sensors on the ground. I already mentioned proximal soil sensing. So, well, it can be either with drones or maybe some measurement device that you put behind your tractor. And so you can do this electromagnetic signals. So the ground radar. So there's lots of ways of collecting information about the soil that could be used as a covariate, as an explanatory variable in digital soil mapping. So what do we do when we do digital soil mapping? Well, we have this generic model, and it looks like this. So let's have a look at that for a minute. I've been talking already quite long, and but I think we're more or less on 2/3 of the total lecture. So that's just that you know that we will get to a close. I think I'm pretty close to our original schedule of 45 minutes. So I think we're fine. So, okay, so the soil, that's our dependent target value. That's what we want to know. And it can be, I write here soil, it can be the pH, the carbon, texture, cation exchange capacity, whatever you're interested in, nitrogen, maybe soil nutrients, and they are a function of location S. So the goal, like I already explained in the previous slide, is to come up with a function that links the soil to your explanatory environmental variables. But no matter how hard we try, no matter how many environmental variables we have, no model is perfect. So we always have a residual. And in pedometrics, in digital soil mapping, we treat it as some kind of a random stochastic variable. And that is actually that part of the soil variation that we cannot explain with our environmental variables. So our aim is always to reduce this to 0, but in practice, we're not able to do that. Now, this residual can be spatially correlated, and then we could characterize it with this semi-variogram that I showed initially at the start of our lecture. And then you can do your statistical interpolation. For those of you familiar with that, that you will recognize it. So you can basically also interpolate spatially that residual if at least there is some signal, there is a spatial correlation in that residual. But in digital soil mapping, usually we focus mostly on getting this function f, the relationship between our environmental variables and our dependent variable. And here is a very simple example. Okay, so this is the example of soil depth. So in parts of the world where we have shallow soils, where you hit the bedrock at a short distance, it may be very worthwhile to know the soil depth. I'm not sure about Nigeria. You have to tell me whether you have that situation too, that parts of the country you have very shallow soils. So the idea is that you can be interested in modeling, in mapping the soil depth. And when you take a digital soil mapping approach, you need your explanatory variables. So you could, for example, use elevation as an explanatory variable, because usually what we find is that in the valleys down at low elevation, you have thicker soils than at the top of the mountain, which can be more rocky. So I think there will be some kind of a correlation between elevation and soil depth. And the same holds for slope angle. Because if you have a very steep soil with a lot of erosion, you expect shallower soils than when you have a horizontal area. And maybe vegetation density, I'll also explain you, if you have a high vegetation density, then when you get eroded material going down, it will be trapped by the vegetation. So when you have a high vegetation, you expect deeper soils, also because the roots of the plants will create soil from the parent material, right? So through weathering and all these kinds of things. So also here, always you look for explanatory variables that have a correlation with your target variable. And once you have modeled that relationship, you can use that model to predict, to estimate the soil everywhere where you know these explanatory variables, and you typically know these everywhere because they're available as maps. The example here, by the way, shows a multiple linear regression model. So in this simple model, we assumed that the relationship between the soil and the explanatory variables is a linear function. Here is an example of that regression combined with kriging, and this was done by my colleague at ISRIC, Bas Kempen, already I think maybe a project 5 years ago for Tanzania. In Tanzania, these are all the locations where the soil organic carbon, so this is not about soil depth, this is soil organic carbon of the topsoil, the 0 to 10 centimeter soil organic carbon concentration. It was measured at, I don't know, maybe 500 or 1,000 locations. Here are those locations too. If you're interested in this, you can visit www.isric.org, and then under projects, you can click the Carbon Mapping Tanzania page, and then you'll get more information, and then also you will get the email address of Bas, who could provide you with more information. So Bas applied this digital, and he did that, of course, in collaboration with local Tanzanian soil scientists. So they applied digital soil mapping, and here is a map of the soil organic carbon in gram per kilogram, so from 0 to up to 200. So some high areas with high concentrations, but also large areas where there is very little soil organic carbon, where it is quite low. Well, I've been mentioning this already a few times. Always in Pedometrics, in digital soil map, we try to quantify the accuracy of our maps. So here you see on the left hand, you see a map of the lower limit, and on the right hand side, you see a map of the upper limit of a 90% prediction interval. So what do these maps tell us? Maybe you can think about that for a minute. So we see here, basically, you have your prediction, but then there is a lower limit and there is an upper limit, and we are 90% certain, at least given, of course, our modeling approach, 90% certain that the true soil organic carbon is between the lower and the upper limit. Yes, what do these maps tell us? I think it tells us that we actually are quite uncertain, because you can see that here we have much lower values than here. So that tells me that that prediction interval is very wide. It's not very narrow, right? So if those maps would be very similar, have the same colors, then we would be very certain about the soil organic carbon. But if they're very far apart, basically it tells us that we are quite uncertain, even though we had, 500,000 observations, and we had all those covariates that helped us to predict the soil organic carbon, we still left with considerable uncertainty. Okay, this was an example of using linear regression. I hope you're still with me. Now what we see the last 5-10 years, that in digital soil mapping we take much more use. It's really also booming, making use of machine learning, or you might also call that statistical learning. I put a slide in here, or a picture of a book. This is by Gareth James and co-authors, Introduction to Statistical Learning. It is a really nice book. It explains it at a fairly accessible level how this all works. So it's increasingly used in digital soil mapping. It's very data driven. Okay. And those models are, you might say, a little bit like black box kind of models because they're quite complex. But it's very flexible, machine learning. So linear regression is very restricted in the sense that it forces a linear relationship. And maybe that relationship is not linear. So with machine learning, you can have much more flexibility in fitting a model. But it needs a lot of data. Okay, so you need to train such a model. And if you have not many observations, it will be difficult to train that model. One often used technique is random forest. And this quantile regression forest is just one version of that in addition to making a prediction map also quantifies the uncertainty. A very recent development is to try to use deep learning, so artificial neural networks with many layers, and also the convolutional neural networks. So this is too advanced, and I also am not an expert on those topics, but just to show you that this is really also an area sorry, in development. And many of those models are tree-based. So here's just a very simple illustration of how we could map again the soil depth based on the explanatory variables. So if elevation, so for example, if elevation is bigger than 400, if you're higher than 400 meters above sea level, but the slope is less than 8 degrees, and the elevation is even higher than 700 meters, then you predict your soil depth as 50 centimeters. So this is just a very simple illustration of such a tree-based model, but you can imagine that in these machine learning models, this gets very, very complex. For example, the random forest model actually makes use of many of these trees. But just to give you a flavor of how this works. Now, I already mentioned to you soil grids. One of the key products, flag products of ISRIC. So you can just visit soilgrids.org to get a closer look. I did that yesterday, and I made a screen dump of, well, this is an example of the sand content in gram per kilogram for this part of the world. So you can see low sand content is the white colored areas, and dark brown is a high sand content up to 800 gram per kilogram. I also zoomed in on Nigeria. Maybe you can tell me how good is this map. But so, and I don't know exactly where are the country boundaries, borders. But apparently, SoilGrids predicts that along the coast here in the delta, the sand content is fairly low because it is a white color. Okay. Well, I can imagine if this is a delta, you probably have more clay than sand. That much I know. But you will have to tell me if this makes sense, yes or no. Of course, we do quantify the uncertainty. And this is a map that you can also look at and download from the soilgrids.org website. So here we characterize uncertainty. In a very high uncertainty are the dark colors, low uncertainty are the white colors. And so we did predict low sand content in this part of Nigeria, but the uncertainty of our prediction is a bit high. Yeah. Okay, so we could explore this later on, and of course, SoilGrids makes a global product. If you want to make a national product, you need the local expertise, and you need to collaborate. And I'm sure we can make a much better map, a more accurate map, if we incorporate local knowledge and local information. Okay, yeah, this is a slide showing you, basically this is the WOSIS database that I mentioned to you before, more or less, and shows you the sampling density that we have in order to calibrate our SoilGrids model. And as you can see, there's some parts of the world, the dark blue colors where we have a large number of observations. But there are also parts of the world, like for example, Russia is very low. Also the Middle East, and well, in the Sahara, I guess not many people go there to take soil samples. So there's a lower sampling density. And of course, the accuracy of the model depends on the sampling density. Now, all that I've talked to you about so far about digital soil mapping was about static soil mapping, mapping a soil property as if it does not change over time. But we do know that some soil properties do change over time, like soil water content and also soil organic carbon. Actually, that's a very hot topic now because of climate change, about trying to, improve the quality of the soils by carbon sequestration. And so the many governments are very interested in monitoring and modeling the carbon change over time. So we're working on that too, but this is a little bit more experimental. So research that we do. And well, we did that for a pilot in Argentina. So we took Argentina in South America as an example, and we modeled the soil organic carbon in space and time in a 36-year period from 1982 till 2017. So here are all the locations, the green dots where we had measurements. And this shows the distribution over time. So for every measurement, we also knew when was that measurement taken, when was the soil sample taken. If you want to do space-time modeling, you also need to know not only where are the soil samples, but also when were they collected. So basically, well, for example, this period we had a lot of soil samples, and here much less, and here also less, and before 1965 very few, but fairly uniform distribution over time. And this is showing you the distribution of the soil samples over depth, sampling depth. So most soil samples are in the topsoil, but there are some soil samples that at a 1 meter depth up to about 2 meter depth. So we did this random forest modeling. So we needed explanatory variables. So we used climate, parent material, terrain, vegetation, all these long list of covariates. You can see NDVI from various seasons during the year were used as explanatory variables, but also the digital elevation model was used. And this is the kind of plot that you get when you do this machine learning techniques. You get to know for each variable, how important is it? Okay. If you want to know more, you can ask me. I can share with you actually the article that we published was published in the European Journal of Soil Science, and it's open access, so you can get hold of it without problem. Now we did a space-time modeling, and we took advantage of the fact that soil organic carbon is related to vegetation, and vegetation is a dynamic variable. So the NDVI, the vegetation index, changes over time, and the temporal variation of NDVI influences the soil organic carbon concentration and the soil organic carbon stock over time. But it's not an instantaneous response, right? So that's why we used, maybe I'm going too much into details, but we used like an exponential decay to allow the vegetation of this year to have an effect on the carbon stock, not only this year, but also next year, the year after, and so on. So it's like a gradual exponential decay influence of NDVI on carbon stock. Now here is the result. And you have to look really carefully, but this is an animation, and it shows the soil organic carbon stock map for the period, the time period that we considered. And if you look carefully, you can see some changes over time. But I think, you are soil scientists, so you know that soil organic carbon spatial variation is much greater, much larger than soil organic carbon temporal variation. And actually, that's why what it makes it also very challenging to do this kind of modeling. And here are time series over time of the soil organic carbon for the entire country. It's over here, and for 3 regions within the country. And if you look, through your eyebrows, you can see that overall there is a decrease of soil organic carbon stock in Argentina from 1978 to 2018 or 17 that we considered. Okay, We are now also working on expanding this to the globe. And I show you here the example of Nigeria again. But for that approach, we took a simpler approach. We use an IPCC, so the International Panel on Climate Change based type of approach, which basically says the carbon stock at any location in time, in space, will change over time depending on the land use. And then you just have lookup table, quite simplistic, pragmatic approach. But we're working on a platform, and the launch of this platform will be like in 2 weeks' time. And then it's open to everybody to look at. And it's quite interesting, I think, because it allows you to look for countries. So I've chosen here Nigeria, and I looked at the historic carbon stock change. So from before humans were on planet Earth and could influence before humans took over, you might say, and influence through agriculture, the land and the soil, we had a carbon stock, which basically, you know, there's a paper on how that was modeled, but basically looking at undisturbed areas. And then what do we have now? And then for every location on the globe at 250 meter resolution, I believe, or 1 kilometer, I'm not sure anymore. We have to check that. You can see whether you had a loss or an increase of the carbon stock. And for Nigeria, the total loss is 480 teragram carbon, but you can do that for any country in the world. So in 2 weeks' time, this web-based platform will be released. And we're really looking forward to get some feedback on that. So maybe if you're interested, just let me know or send me an email or just provide feedback through the platform. Okay, I'm almost done. Maybe 2 more slides and then I'll come to my conclusions. So digital soil mapping is not only about mapping soil properties like clay, sand, pH, carbon, but we would, that's what the users demand us, what they require is to map soil functions. So another hot topic in soil science, I'm not sure but about Nigeria, but for sure in Europe, the European Union also quite, you know, and the FAO very much involved with mapping soil functions like biodiversity, food production, flood regulation, nutrient cycling. So they're on this list, and they vary also in space and perhaps even in time. So we might want to map those too. I'll give you one example of that. I think the rootable depth and the root zone plant available water holding capacity of the soil, that you might call that a soil function. Anyway, it's a derived soil property. And so my colleague Johan Leenaars from ISRIC, he is the main author of this work, and he worked also in the GIGA project, so the Global Yield Gap Atlas project. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. Was involved as well to map the root zone plant available water holding capacity, which of course is very important for agriculture. And this is the map that he produced. You may want to make sense for Nigeria, and can we maybe do better in collaboration with you? Okay, final slide, my conclusions. So this topic, this presentation was about pedometrics and digital soil mapping. I hope that I have made clear that pedometrics is a rapidly developing subdiscipline of soil science, and it has strong links with statistics and computer science. Digital soil mapping is only one of the topics of pedometrics, but it is the biggest one, and it gets a lot of attention. So there's many people working on that. And I think I looked at the 5-year action plan of the Nigeria Institute of Soil Science, and you have your 5 pillars that you want to work on and that you're working on. And I think pedometrics has an important role to play, especially in particular in pillar 4, which is on enhancing the quantity and quality of soil data and information through data collection and also standardization of the data, obviously, analysis, modeling, validation, reporting, monitoring, and integration with our disciplines. So I think that's really an area where we could try and join forces. So, and I think I speak on behalf of all of my ISRIC colleagues that we would be very happy to team up with Nigerian soil scientists to engage in pedometrics and digital soil mapping activities, and maybe also in many other topics within soil science. But well, okay, I was representing here pedometrics and digital soil mapping. Okay, thank you for your attention.